By the 31st of January 2018, in Tehran's Shorabad industrial district, the building looks like what it is meant to look like. Another anonymous warehouse in the southern sprawl. Nothing in the exterior says history. Nothing says state memory. The public record does not preserve the small gestures in that first minute. What a hand steadied. What a glance counted. A narrow night window and a plan built around it. Later accounts agree on the shape of the task. Safes, heat, wait, and departure before a morning shift arrived. Months later, on a stage far from Shorabad, a leader reduces the night to inventory. 55,000 pages and tens of thousands of digital files. In the footage, the room is bright. In the operation, it was never about brightness. It was about what the clock would cost. A long operation is not one night. It is the decision to keep living normally, while preparing to do something that cannot be normal. By mid-July 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action became the public architecture for preventing an Iranian nuclear weapon. Technical limits on enrichment, monitoring provisions, and the premise that verification could substitute for faith. In the years that followed, the argument around the deal was not only technical, it was psychological. The agreement asked whether a state that once pursued weapons work could be trusted to abandon what it once tried to build. By December 2015, the International Atomic Energy Agency released what it called its final assessment on past and present outstanding issues regarding Iran's nuclear program. The report formalized what many analysts already suspected. Iran had conducted organized activities relevant to the development of a nuclear explosive device prior to 2003, and some activities persisted afterward, though without the same coordinated structure. The bureaucratic language was careful restraint deployed to describe something inherently political. In Israeli political circles, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu continued to treat the agreement as an illusion that could be marketed but never relied upon. In later briefings and investigative reporting, the proof problem became central. If you want to change policy, you need material that third parties can examine and authenticate. A photograph can be dismissed as fabrication. A physical archive, thousands of pages, hundreds of compact discs, is harder to explain away. The cover story of the next 2 years, what many people inside Iran and outside it experienced as normal time, became part of the mechanism. Normal life continued. Paperwork continued. The world kept turning on its axis. The operation, meanwhile, began to construct itself around one recurring motif, a clock that would eventually have to be obeyed. Agreements manage enrichment levels. They do not manage intent. By 2017, intelligence assessments had coalesced around a specific location. In a public presentation later released through official Israeli government channels, Netanyahu claimed Iran had moved nuclear weapons files to what he described as a highly secret location in Tehran, identified as the Shorabad district in the city's southern industrial belt, and framed the relocation as deliberate concealment. Not only what was built, but what was saved for later. Independent reporting later converged on the same basic description: an unremarkable warehouse in Shorabad, industrial surroundings, a site chosen precisely because it did not look defended. The public record does not provide a full blueprint of Iranian physical security at the site, and responsible accounts remain cautious about tradecraft specifics. But the logic is legible to anyone who has studied denial and deception. Archives are safer when they do not resemble archives. Some later analyses emphasize duration. Surveillance and planning are portrayed not as a week of preparation but as a multi-year intelligence effort. What the cover demands, in practical terms, is patience, years of watching without acting, and the particular strain of sustained deception where the body is asked to treat danger as routine. The operatives, their identities still protected by official silence, would have lived double lives across that span. They would have had neighbors. They would have made small talk. They would have watered plants and returned library books and done all the ordinary things that ordinary people do while preparing for something that could never be ordinary. The record cannot name most of the people who did that watching. That absence is part of the cover, too. Intelligence services protect sources and methods with a ferocity that outlasts the operations themselves. What remains is the outline: a warehouse, a city, and the slow accumulation of certainty that became a plan. The safest hiding place is often the one that resembles boredom. Later investigative reporting describes planners settling on the night of 31 January 2018, and a time window of roughly 6.5 hours, enough to enter, breach safes, and remove heavy material without detection. That number is not cinematic. It is administrative, the kind of constraint that creates its own particular fear. 6.5 hours is long enough to make mistakes. It is short enough that you cannot recover from them. Subsequent summaries describe the mechanics in broad strokes. A break-in at a warehouse in Shorabad. Safes cut open with thermal tools. Departure before a morning guard shift arrived. The operation's tempo matters because it reveals the true antagonist. The enemy was not a guard patrol. The enemy was time itself. The public record does not supply a full operational diagram. Routes, vehicle models, communications protocols, safehouse layouts. Where sources are silent, the only honest posture is restraint. Speculation fills vacuums, but speculation is not history. What remains are the non-negotiables: the location in Shorabad, the window that began after dark and closed before dawn, and the fact that physical material, heavy, awkward, and difficult to move without noise, was removed from the site. The recurring motif tightens here. Every decision in the planning phase would have been measured against that constraint. How long to cut a safe? How many operatives to deploy? How much weight could be carried per trip? How much margin remained if something went wrong? The operation was not designed around heroism. It was designed around arithmetic. A covert plan is a schedule with consequences. The target is not only a warehouse. The target is a state's decision to preserve the knowledge of how to build a weapon. In the archive Israel later described, the material was framed as documentation of Project AMAD, the code name for a covert program aimed at producing nuclear weapons. According to Israeli and American assessments, Project AMAD operated under the direction of physicist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh and was organized within the Iranian Defense Ministry. Later expert analysis based on briefings and material derived from the archive treats it as depicting a coherent, top-down weapons development effort, one with technical research, organizational structure, and planning that extended well beyond a handful of isolated experiments. This matters because it shifts the moral frame. If the archive is accurate, then the story is not about rogue engineers pursuing curiosity. It is about governance, committees, approvals, institutional memory, and the quiet decision to keep the option alive even when the public stance changes. States do not preserve weapons documentation by accident. They preserve it because someone believes it might be needed again. The documentary posture here must remain disciplined. Claims about what specific documents show are claims, not omniscient truth, unless the underlying documents are publicly released and independently examined. Where the record is mediated through government briefings and journalistic summaries, the narration says so. The IAEA has subsequently reported finding traces of nuclear material at undeclared sites, findings that Israeli officials have connected to leads from the archive. But the causal chain between seized documents and inspection findings involves layers of interpretation. Weapons programs are rarely built by hatred alone. They are built by meetings and budgets. By the 30th of April 2018, Netanyahu staged the archive as physical proof. Standing before cameras in Tel Aviv, he presented binders, compact discs, shelving the visual language of stored bureaucratic labor. The scale became the headline. Approximately 55,000 pages and hundreds of compact discs containing tens of thousands of additional files. The claim was not only that Iran had done weapons-relevant work in the past, but that it had preserved the record deliberately. Reporting around the event repeated the location: Shorabad, southern Tehran, portrayed as a warehouse chosen for anonymity rather than fortification. The timing of the presentation was political. It landed as the United States approached a decision point on whether to remain in the nuclear agreement. The archive became evidence in an argument about the future dressed as a revelation about the past. The public record does not specify the exact Iranian chain of custody that placed the archive in Shorabad, nor does it provide a complete Iranian inventory of what was stored there. But it does show the strategic logic from the Iranian perspective. Keep the knowledge, even if you claim the program ended. Keep the option, even if you sign an agreement. Nuclear latency, the capacity to build a weapon without having built one, requires preserved expertise. Expertise requires records. The clock motif returns in a new form here. Operations run on hours. Politics runs on deadlines. The 30th of April was not a random date. It was chosen because other clocks were ticking. American decision cycles, alliance management, the calculus of when revelation would have maximum impact. States do not only hide what they are doing, they hide what they might do later. The tension was never about whether Iran had past weapons-relevant activity. International assessments already addressed that question. The real tension was about what the archive changed regarding present risk. Some observers emphasized that much of the material described historical work rather than proving a current violation of the nuclear agreement at that moment. Others treated the archive as reason to doubt long-term Iranian intentions and to demand tougher verification going forward. This is where target and cover begin to mirror each other. A covert operation wants clean conclusions. We obtained the material, therefore the truth is known. Verification regimes work differently. They translate documents into questions, questions into inspections, inspections into more documents. The archive did not close the loop. It opened new iterations of an old argument. The moral ambiguity thickens here. If the operation's purpose was to strengthen non-proliferation by exposing concealment, it may also have served domestic and allied political aims. Evidence can be authentic and still be deployed selectively. Documents can be genuine and still be presented with timing designed to maximize political effect. The archive's existence does not automatically validate every claim made about its significance. The clock motif becomes psychological now. The longer you hold a secret, the more it shapes the person holding it. Whether that person is a state or an individual operative, Iran held the archive for years. Israel, once it possessed the material, faced its own version of the same pressure. When to reveal, how much to share, what to hold back for future leverage. Evidence can be authentic and still be used as a tool. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the physicist identified in international reports as the head of Project AMAD, had become a kind of ghost in the non-proliferation literature, a name attached to assessments, rarely photographed, never interviewed by Western journalists. The archive reportedly contained documents bearing his name and describing organizational structures under his authority. In November 2020, Fakhrizadeh was assassinated on a road near Tehran. The killing occurred more than 2 years after the archive operation, but some analysts have drawn a line between the intelligence gathered in Shorabad and subsequent targeting. This connection remains circumstantial in the public record. No government has officially confirmed that archive material contributed to the assassination, but the sequence raises questions that responsible narration cannot ignore. The documentary posture here requires care. An archive of documents is not the same as a targeting package. The decision to kill a scientist involves considerations beyond what any single intelligence collection can provide. Yet the archive reportedly included personnel information, organizational charts, and operational details that would have been relevant to anyone tracking Iran's nuclear leadership. The weight of that knowledge, who had it, what they did with it, remains classified. What can be said is simpler and heavier. An archive is not neutral. It contains names. Names belong to people. People can become targets. The line between intelligence collection and operational action is supposed to be bright, but archives blur it. Knowledge is never just knowledge. It is always also power over someone. The warehouse in Shorabad sat at the intersection of several Iranian bureaucratic systems. Defense Ministry oversight, intelligence service awareness, and whatever security protocols governed access to sensitive historical material. The archive's existence implied that someone, or several someones, had decided the documentation was worth keeping despite the risk that keeping it posed. This is the part of the story that remains most opaque. Why did Iran preserve the archive rather than destroy it? The standard explanation is institutional memory. States preserve options, and options require documentation. A more cynical interpretation suggests that bureaucratic inertia prevented what caution should have demanded. A third possibility is that the archive was kept precisely because someone believed it might be needed for a future program restart. The documentary record cannot resolve which explanation is correct. What it can show is the consequence. The archive existed, and because it existed, it could be taken. The decision to preserve was also a decision to accept vulnerability. Every filing cabinet is a liability if the wrong people learn where it sits. The clock motif transforms again here. Time creates archives. Time also degrades security. The longer material sits in one place, the more people learn about it, the more opportunities arise for compromise. Iran's decision to keep the documentation in Shorabad for years meant that Israeli intelligence had years to find it. Patience on one side became vulnerability on the other. If the past was preserved in binders and disks, then the future could be rebuilt from them, or stolen. This operation is remembered not for gunfire, but for heat, weight, and the discipline of silence. On the night of 31 January 2018, in Tehran's Shorabad district, a team entered a warehouse and began working against both metal and time. Later accounts describe a window of roughly 6.5 hours, enough to breach safes and remove material, but not enough to correct mistakes or absorb delays. Some descriptions emphasize the tools, thermal cutting equipment applied to safe doors, and the deadline departure before a morning guard shift. The public record does not provide a full diagram of the internal layout or the specific sequence of movements inside the building. Where sources stop, the narration stops with them. Invention is not reconstruction. What can be said responsibly is simple and heavy. Safes were opened. Paper and digital media were removed. The sensory reality of that night, the smell of cut metal, the weight of binders, the sound of compact discs being stacked belongs to the people who were there. The record preserves only the outline. If you want the operation to feel real, you follow the constraints. Metal resists thermal cutting at predictable rates. Paper tears when handled carelessly. Discs snap under pressure. Time does not care about ideology or urgency. The operatives would have known these facts the way any craftsman knows the limits of tools and materials. The work was manual. The stakes were existential. Covert action is often manual labor performed under existential stakes. Israeli messaging later emphasized physicality. The material was described as massive, measured in boxes, binders, and the implied weight of institutional memory. Some reporting claims the documents were moved out of Iran quickly, possibly that same night or within days, while other accounts remain careful about the exact extraction pathway. This is where discipline matters in factual documentary. The end state is verifiable. By late April 2018, the archive was in Israel and presented publicly. The precise logistics of how it crossed borders, what vehicles were used, which transit points were involved. These details are not fully disclosed in credible public sourcing. Responsible narration does not fill gaps with plausible invention. The human cost is mostly off-screen. Secrecy protects participants. It also hides the part that hurts, the moment when operatives realize that success does not end a mission. It extends it, because now the material must be exploited, authenticated, translated, and eventually weaponized for political purposes. The people who carried the binders out of Shorabad handed them to analysts, who handed them to briefers, who handed them to policymakers. The chain is long. Each link involves its own kind of pressure. The clock motif changes meaning here. It becomes the first thing someone notices in the quiet after action. When the immediate danger passes, time dilates. Hours feel longer. The body remembers what the mind tries to file away. For the operatives, wherever they are now, whatever names they carry, the night in Shorabad would have marked a boundary between before and after. Success is often measured in kilograms, because kilograms don't argue back. After the operation became public, American officials stated that they assessed the material as authentic, and that it had been reviewed by experts over an extended period. This is not the raid. This is the second operation, turning seized material into authoritative judgment. Here, the covert becomes bureaucratic. The archive was processed. Files were translated from Farsi. Technical diagrams were reviewed by weapons specialists. Videos and engineering notes were analyzed for consistency with known physics. Analysts attempted to map what was genuinely new, what corroborated older concerns, and what might be incomplete or curated to mislead. The human strain in this phase is quieter but persistent. Sustained operational security does not end when the raid ends. It migrates. Analysts cannot speak freely about methods. Diplomats must choose words that preserve alliances and protect sources. Inspectors and non-proliferation experts must decide which leads can be pursued through official channels without revealing how the information was originally obtained. The recurring motif, the clock reappears as deadlines in new forms, briefing schedules, policy decision windows, the slow institutional pace at which contested intelligence becomes accepted conclusion. The archive did not speak for itself. It required interpreters, and interpreters always bring their own assumptions to the text. In intelligence, proof is not an object, it is a process. Aftermath is where moral accounting begins, usually without the people most affected getting to testify. Iran rejected the Israeli account and publicly dismissed the notion of a successful raid in Tehran. The denial was not only defensive, it was strategic. Admitting the raid would mean admitting the archive existed and that it mattered. Iranian officials characterized the presentation as fabrication, theater designed to justify American withdrawal from the nuclear agreement. At the same time, American officials reiterated their authenticity assessments, and analysis continued. The archive became a contested object in international discourse, not only a question of whether it happened, but what it authorized next. Media coverage reflected the split. Some accounts treated Netanyahu's presentation as political theater timed to influence American policy. Others treated it as necessary disclosure, proof that Iran had preserved weapons-relevant knowledge while claiming to have abandoned the program. Both interpretations circulated because the archive sat at the intersection of technical verification and state narrative. Documents do not interpret themselves. They require context, and context is always contested. If there were internal Iranian consequences, arrests, investigations, blame assigned to security officials, credible public detail remains limited and inconsistent. Where sources cannot specify, the narration does not pretend to know. Some Iranian security personnel may have lost positions. Others may have been protected by the same opacity that protected the archive in the first place. Denial is sometimes a form of damage control, not a claim about truth. On the 8th of May, 2018, 8 days after Netanyahu's presentation, President Donald Trump announced that the United States would withdraw from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The archive presentation became part of the argument surrounding that decision, though analysts disagree about how much weight it carried. Attribution should remain disciplined. The archive may have provided political justification for some audiences, while others argue it did not fundamentally change the technical question of whether Iran was complying with the agreement at that moment. A document can describe past activity and still be deployed as evidence about present risk. A claim can be politically timed and still be grounded in genuine material. For non-proliferation, the aftermath is not a clean victory or defeat. It is a transition into an era where verification became harder, diplomatic trust thinned, and escalation risk increased. The raid's tactical success material obtained, operatives extracted, and its strategic consequences do not align neatly. An intelligence triumph can feed a policy outcome that creates new dangers. By late September 2018, Netanyahu addressed the United Nations General Assembly and expanded the narrative, pointing to another Tehran area location and calling directly for international inspection. The archive's long tail had begun, a seized dataset generating leads, questions, and new cycles of accusation and denial. The clock motif reaches its final transformation. At the beginning of this story, time was a tool, something operatives worked against and within. In the end, time is what investigators fight. Delays, altered sites, moved materials, hardened explanations. Even when evidence is real, time can make it unusable. The raid is described, in subsequent accounts, as completed before dawn. What remains publicly are photographs of safes, a leader's inventory of pages and files, and arguments that continue years later. The story ends the way verification stories often end, not with confession, but with absence. A warehouse that once held a state's memory becomes just a building again, metal, concrete, and the kind of quiet that can be mistaken for peace.